Welcome to The State of Us. Real people with honest opinions and the future of responsible media. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Each day, Americans surrender their private information. From airports to their place of work and social media to their smartphones, countless entities claim to have your best interest in mind. Do they really? And how should we approach the loaded term of privacy in the 21st century? History may yield some answers to these questions. In the new book, None of Your Damn Business, we get an overview of the history of privacy in the United States and a lens from which to examine privacy in the modern age. Today, we get to speak with the author of the book, Lawrence Capello. Lawrence is an information privacy professional, an assistant professor of U.S. constitutional history at the University of Alabama, and he received his Ph.D. from the City University of New York. Lawrence, thank you for being here.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
And of course, we couldn't begin this critical conversation on privacy without
your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Good day, sir. I'm glad you're here. And from one fellow history teacher to another, I absolutely loved your book.
Nice. Thanks a lot.
All right. So let's get right into it here, Lawrence. To many, privacy probably seems like a kind of unapproachable topic. Many would probably indicate that they want some degree of privacy, but it doesn't seem to be an issue that most people are seriously concerned about. So why should someone care about privacy today?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm a privacy professional, but like you said, my main job is as an historian. And when you study American history long enough, one of the things you realize is that every generation of Americans tends to have this one or two epic struggles that comes to define them. In the 30s and 40s, it's about whether or not the government should establish a social safety net. It's like the New Deal to get us through the Depression and how much power it should have to regulate the economy. In the 60s and 70s, the struggles about civil rights and gender equality and the growing sexual revolution. In the 80s and 90s, it's the culture wars. Privacy is absolutely one of the great defining social and political struggles that's facing the present generation. Americans today enjoy way less privacy than their parents and grandparents did at their age. And so perhaps more for any other reason, that's why people should care. And I think if we take a close look at things on the ground right now, we see that a lot of people care a ton about privacy. I don't know anyone who doesn't have a password on their phone. Cybersecurity is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and millions of people either tuned into or read about the Mark Zuckerberg hearings testifying before Congress about Cambridge Analytica. And that spawned 1,000 memes, and, it was both hilarious and terrifying at the same time. But those hearings also convinced a lot of people that our lack of data privacy has now gotten to a point where it's maybe damaging the very fabric of our democratic system. But I know what you mean when you say that it seems sometimes like people don't care. If we take a step back, I think the truth of it is that there's always going to be large groups of people who don't care that much about their privacy, at least not until the dangers are staring them right in the face or impacting them on a hyper-personal level. I think a lot of those people tend to be young adults nowadays. But while I agree there's always going to be people who don't care about privacy, millions and millions of people really do. And I think we're at a tipping point right now where the American public is really starting to get way more in touch with this topic.
All right. So you've talked about the why we should be concerned, but at the beginning of your book, you start by discussing what privacy means. How would you explain the loaded term of privacy to our audience?
So privacy is what they call an umbrella term. It's kind of like the word love or freedom or liberty. It's so big that it becomes really slippery. And so if you want to make sense of it, it has to be placed in a specific context. So a really good way to think about data privacy, which is the big topic right now, would be with a definition that was offered by this really brilliant privacy scholar. His name is Alan Weston. He just died in 2013. And what he said was that privacy is the ability to control when, how, and to what extent information about you is communicated to others. So let's stick with this for a second. It's not the perfect definition, but it's a really good place to start. Privacy is about controlling and limiting access to your personal information. So why is that important? Why do people want to control information? Well, we want to control information about ourselves because doing so gives us a measure of control over the ways that we're perceived by other people. Privacy gives us control over our own self-narratives, over the ways that we're perceived by others. And having control over what information people have about you and don't have about you is really crucial if you want to navigate modern society. Think about the way that you guys just personally share information with people. It's not like you have two piles, right? Like information that you share and information that you don't. What you share and don't share depends a lot on the context of your relationships. There are things that you're going to share with parents, but not with your friends. There are things that you share with your friends and not with your parents, things that you definitely wouldn't share with your employer, and things that you definitely wouldn't say on the air. And we share information and hold things back because we want to have some control over how those people view us and control over our self-narrative. And that's important. No one has a right to control everything about how people view them. But because, people make up their own minds. Mm-hmm. But for thousands of years, people have always had a large measure of control in shaping their reputation. And that control is something that's really eroding away very, very rapidly and only very, very recently. The problem nowadays is we're just leaving behind all of these snippets of information, dozens of snippets every day. Sometimes we know about it, sometimes we don't. And the problem with modern privacy about having so much information out there is that we lose control of our narratives before we even engage people in the first time. So look, like if you study, I know you guys read a lot of psychological studies. Social psychology shows us that the first impressions people have of us are formed usually super quickly. And they're based on only a few pieces of information, and they're very hard to dislodge. Now, this kind of sucks, and I wish it wasn't the case, but scientifically speaking, it just is. It's how people make value judgments. Because the cold truth of it is, when it comes to forming opinions of other people, me and you included, we're kind of the worst. All of us are garbage, right? In this regard. People, most of us judge ourselves by our intentions and everyone else by their actions and the snippets of information that we have about one another. And our opinions of others often have very little regard for the depths of their lives and for the capacity of people to grow and to change. Like Whitman says, right? We all contain multitudes. But the fact is, to live in society is to make snap judgments about people. And we put people into nice, tight little packages. And so the ability to exercise control over those facts that are out there around you is regarded by almost every society as a fundamental right. It's not just an individual right, but it's a larger societal right. And most importantly, it's a legal right.
Well, like you point out, true, but like you point out, and I think was really so important for me when I was reading the book, is how this information now is taken, I'm going to use the term and correct me, but taken out of context. How people take this information we've given to them for one reason, and then the computer or whoever is running the program takes it and forms a different opinion of us than even the reason why we gave up the information in the first place. That's the really scary thing as I was reading the book.
Thanks. It's a double-edged sword because you could have two problems. One is you can pump it into an algorithm, those snippets of information, 5,000, 7,000 data points over a couple of years. And like you said, you could get something that's strikingly true about yourself that you never intended to let anybody know. Right. That's called secondary use. But like you said too, it can completely distort who you are. If I was doing, I'm an academic. If I'm doing research on terrorism and 9/11 laws, and I start looking for ways that people were making bombs, you could just take my library list and show it to people, and it could look like I was a terrorist.
Exactly.
Not having the ability to add context to the information is essential. It's one of the reasons that all of us, I think, would be so terrified if they just posted up our browser histories and didn't let us explain what was going on, or if you took a paragraph out of an email instead of the entire thing. The ability to add context and not just be boiled down to these snippets is one of the reasons that all of us want to be able to control that. And that was way before the digital age and way before the internet. It's just, when you talk to any skilled lawyers, skilled interrogators, any lawyer worth his salt who's a trial lawyer, that guy can take a series of facts, put you on the stand, and paint whatever picture he wants to paint about you, and then he can go and argue it the exact opposite way afterwards. And so to control those snippets it's a fundamental aspect of just what it is to live in a society.
When we talk about Lawrence, we want to understand some of your motivation to write the book, but part of what I thought's interesting and that we fight sometimes, because Lance and I talk about this a good bit when we're talking to people. One of these misnomers that comes up all the time, right, is this, well, if I'm not doing anything wrong, then I have nothing to hide. And I think, as you've explained, this contextual argument is a great way to understand. It doesn't so much have to do with if you're doing something wrong or not. It just has to do with being able to function in a society at all where information truly is power and is perhaps, arguably one of the most important things that we have a right to. And so with that, what was your motivation to write this book, and who would be interested in reading it? Who would it be useful for?
So I grew up in Queens, New York in the 80s and 90s from an Italian-American family. And my sister and I were raised in an environment that put a lot of cultural emphasis on respecting other people's privacy, particularly my mother and my grandmother. And at least 3 times a week, my sister and I were being told by someone to mind our business. When 9/11 happened, I was a student at Queens College, and there was a lot of debate at the time in classrooms about the Patriot Act. And I started reading about privacy rights, and I learned that the United States had hands down the weakest privacy laws of all the advanced democracies, even before 9/11. And I was shocked. This was America. I thought we were all about limited government and private property and, get the hell off my lawn and all that. So I was curious about how could America be that country that had the weakest privacy laws. And my book, None of Your Damn Business, is the answer to that question.
Sounds good.
We're talking with Lawrence Capello. He's an information privacy professional and the author of None of Your Damn Business, a recent book that was released on privacy in the United States from the Gilded Age to the digital age. We're going to talk more about some of the specifics, the history behind privacy. Yes, it's not really a new concept yet, as Lawrence has pointed out. It is defining us in new ways constantly. Keep it right here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
None of your damn business. Privacy in the United States from the Gilded Age to the Digital Age, a new book by Lawrence Capello, an information privacy professional and assistant professor of U.S. constitutional history at the University of Alabama. We've talked a little bit so far about understanding why he wrote the book and why people should care about privacy today. During the numerous wars in American history, the government tends to increase its interest in the lives of its citizens. Does a national threat, Lawrence, justify some privacy sacrifices?
National security is very important, obviously, especially in wartime. And our leaders absolutely have a responsibility to keep us safe. But this comes down to a question of balance. I'm saying this as a privacy advocate. The worst kind of privacy activists are the guys with the tinfoil hats on their head who demand absolute privacy all the time and say the government has no right to search their house. Of course they do. It's right there in the Constitution. It's in the Fourth Amendment. The trouble is that when you look at the history of the United States in wartime, though, our leaders have this tradition of going way too far with surveillance practices and violations of our civil liberties. And they get to a point where they start to move outside the parameters and the spirit of the Constitution and the Fourth Amendment. And that's not acceptable. The Constitution gives us a lot of guidance on how to handle this situation. The government can, of course, invade your privacy, but they have to jump through a bunch of hoops before they do it. Investigators need probable cause. Then they need to take that cause to a judge and they need to plead their case, which means violating someone's privacy. Before you can do that, you have to go to 2 different branches of government. And then after it goes to the judge, they can't just search anything they want. The search is limited to specific areas. Things like the Patriot Act, things like a lot of the things we did after World War I, also after World War II, and especially during the Cold War, they become problematic because they try to skirt these limitations. Especially there are things like dragnet searches. You've ever heard that term before?
Yes, I have.
So basically, the things become very problematic and the sacrifices are unacceptable when the government starts grabbing large amounts of data from everybody, regardless of if they're a suspect or not, and regardless of probable cause, and they just start sifting through it until they find what they're looking for.
Well, it's kind of if we give them an inch, right, they take a mile. And part of, I think, what you highlight, too, that's important that people don't get is it's not just they use wartime as the justification, but then a lot of times these things don't go away either, right?
Absolutely. It's so much easier for the government to take a couple of inches of power than it is for us to dislodge that power once the wartime's over. And you usually hear that from leaders. Look, I just need to do this because this is an emergency. As soon as the emergency is over, hey, we're totally going to give it back. Study the history of human civilization. Things don't tend to usually work out that way. The question and the most important part of this, though, is balance, because there is not going to be a perfect system. You're never going to have one where the government can look at everything they need to keep us safe and also not violate our civil liberties. So it's about really understanding where an acceptable balance is. The real scumbags you have to look out for, and the people who historically screw over the American people, are the people who talk about these things in all or nothing terms. When they're like, look, we can either have privacy or we can be safe from terrorists. and that's it. No, that's not it at all.
Yep,
that
exactly.
argument doesn't fly. And, there's an old expression, tyranny is the death of nuance. The idea, understandably, is an acceptable balance, what you're looking for. In wartime, we can maybe alter that balance a bit as realists, but we can't lose control over our core principles. Because the fact of the matter is, and this is something that I try to instill in my students, is when you live in a free society, the fact of the matter is you just are less safe. That's part of the trade-off. It doesn't mean you're entirely vulnerable, but the safest place in the world is a totalitarian regime. If you want to be free, if you want to be part of a free society, you do leave yourself open to a little more harm than others do. And our founders understood this. It's a big aspect of the Constitution. A lot of people would respond to that maybe by saying, well, the Constitution's not a suicide pact. But to those people, I would say, I thought we were all about give me liberty or give me death, right? That there are things that are worse.
You can keep we can preach. We can give you another hour and let you preach from the mountaintop, because I'm sitting here amening you and shaking my head. I've said many of the same things in the public school setting for 30 years as a history teacher. It's like, do you want to be free, or do you want to be safe? And it is finding a balance. But you are so right, and we give up so many freedoms because we think it's going to make us safe. And then what you point out in the book and what we study in history is that most of the time it was all very unnecessary, that they really didn't find out anything with that dragnet policy or other things that they did. We just did it because we were scared, and when it made us feel safer when there really wasn't a threat, or it didn't really make us feel any safer either. So.
Right. And what gets really problematic too is the way that a lot of people in those circumstances, they don't speak up, because if it's not happening to them, they tend not to really have a problem.
Right. Well, it's not going to happen to me. It's those people over there. And it's like, well, as soon as you are the people that everybody's afraid of, then it's going to happen to you too. And they can't fathom that. They can't come to that conclusion without it actually happening.
And that doesn't apply to national security issues with privacy. I mean, that's also the thing with data privacy. A lot of those people who are like, well, I don't really care, about target marketing and things. And you're like, well, you're not thinking bigger picture enough. And it's, right. You haven't been the victim yet, but it's important to think broadly and more broadly about those things. And
very good. Yep. And as you mentioned that, my next question is, when we say online privacy, most people think about websites and other entities using data like shopping records and media choices. But you explain that contrary to popular opinion, most companies aren't exploiting this information for nefarious reasons. So then how are they using it?
Well, don't get me wrong. Most of the major tech companies, Google, Facebook, Equifax, the credit bureau, these companies are using, or at least have used, data in ways that are very, very problematic. And in some cases, like with Cambridge Analytica, that's just the most recent one, the data collected from some of their platforms was used in ways that can and should be regarded as absolutely nefarious. I mean, I don't know if you saw the new Netflix documentary on Cambridge Analytica, but Brittany Kaiser, who was one of their employees,
yes.
She testified that her company's use of Facebook data allowed for the use of what she called weapons grade communications tactic.
Right.
And those tactics were used against the UK and the United States. And so by all means, there
are companies that do it. There have been examples of it, but for most of the time, or, at least the majority of the time, why are they doing this? I mean, why is it even an issue that they even get? I mean, because they're doing it for some of them more companies are doing it just for other reasons. And then some companies are like all of us, they have a devious mind and they figure out, hey, we can use it for this and gain power.
Absolutely.
But most of
the companies that I do business with in terms of consulting, especially smaller companies, they're using data. They're not selling it to people. They're using it in ways that ultimately can make their businesses more efficient, so that their marketing campaigns are more specifically targeted. And at the end of the day, a lot of people don't have a problem with that. And again, that's one of my main arguments about privacy, is to recognize that privacy, the things that push up against it, privacy is super important, but the things that push up against it usually are important as well, like national security, for example. And in this regard, big data does make companies more efficient. It allows us to create these amazing companies that go off and perform wondrous deeds in the economy and can be major global players and, can really help increase consumerism and convenience and all of those things and make these things run more effectively. And to a large degree, there is a lot of good that happens, but there's also a lot of bad. I give a lot of talks about this, and people usually come up to me afterwards and they say they don't really care if Amazon uses their purchase history to recommend a better item or to get their item shipped faster. But what they don't want is that data to be plugged into some algorithm that they don't have any control over. And that's the big issue. The data that originally can be used for one purpose, like just making a business more efficient or having better service for its customers,
to all these other things. And
right.
And that's the danger. And I think that's, as you highlighted, and that's part of what I liked throughout your book, is that you took, you talked about there's the unbalanced approach that a lot of people take with so many things, but privacy is one of those. It's either all or none. And it doesn't need to be that way. And in fact, probably shouldn't be, because just because I tell Amazon that it's okay to make a recommendation based on my purchase history doesn't necessarily mean I should also be signing away the right for them to share that data with 100 other companies. And I think that's really important that a lot of people don't understand, is that it is kind of right now, unfortunately, all or nothing, but right, we've seen some new legislation come into play that's changed some of that recently, or is trying to modify it to make it so that we should have more specific control over what a company can and cannot do with it. But, and on that same note, it's clear that there's a lot of downsides to the excessive erosion of privacy. And often, particularly like you highlighted in a free country like ours, things swing back and forth. And often when we move into a digital age, it swings too far one way, and then we do some correction like we're doing now. So where do we draw the line? Obviously, right, we can't have total privacy. It's just not realistic. And we haven't had. I mean, pretty much for the history of this country, we haven't. It's relative to the time, but we haven't had that. So how do we draw the line today?
So, a lot of different, I'm glad you asked that question. Obviously, there's going to be two main approaches that we as a nation need to take, and we need to take them kind of simultaneously. Like you said, in order to respect the middle ground, you need to have way more consumer choice in terms of what people can do with their data. Personal data needs to be reframed as a fundamental human right and as something that exists as personal property. This means if you want it, I give you my affirmative consent, or you don't get it. No more of this thing where you get my data automatically unless I opt out. You want my data, I have to opt in. Also, there needs to be what's called the right to be forgotten, which is something that's very, very popular in Europe right now, because we're at a point where we're all become prisoners of our recorded past. I mean, I joke with my friends that I'm so glad I grew up in the 80s and the 90s so that all the crazy stuff I did when I was a kid, which wasn't that crazy, but still, like that, none of that stuff is just there permanently for people to look at. Today's young people are the first generation to really, there's a reason they're called the guinea pig generation. They're the first ones to have almost every aspect of that stuff documented in a way that's very permanent. So being able to erase and access your data on some level to keep us from being prisoners of our recorded past is really important. So increased choice, affirmative consent, opting in, knowing what people can and can't do with your data, and then also keeping a right to be forgotten, to access your data and then have that erased. Just like you can with a credit report, just like you can with, bad financial transactions that you made. The reason that you're allowed to have a bankruptcy removed from your credit report after 7 years is because our system already recognizes that people grow and change and that they shouldn't be held accountable for things they did super far back. It's the same reason that every crime except murder has a statute of limitations on it. It's because we as a society recognize that. So the right to be forgotten, and then more choice over what happens with your data, and you have to provide affirmative consent before people are allowed to share it in any way that you have a problem with.
Sounds like a great Twilight Zone episode.
Yeah.
Lance always has the references for us. We're going to talk some more about solutions and what you individually can do. We've been speaking with Lawrence Capello, who is an information privacy professional and the author of None of Your Damn Business. Keep it right here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Lawrence Capello is the author of None of Your Damn Business, Privacy in the United States from the Gilded Age to the Digital Age. And as you could guess, it's a history book, and that means that Lance is a big fan. So, we've been talking so far about some of the details of the history components, along with understanding privacy in general. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what you specifically, along with government and institutions, can do. As many of our listeners know, and Lawrence, one of the main goals on The State of Us is to discuss solutions or actionable steps that people can take. When everyone has a camera in their pockets today and access to mass communication systems like social media, what practical steps can an individual take to protect their personal information?
So first and foremost, think about default settings on your environment. You do not have to live in a cave. You do not have to just shun all of the technology that you have. It's just a lot of problems start simply because the default settings on your phone, on your laptop, on your tablet are set to provide the company that sold it to you or your internet provider with a lot more information than you may be comfortable with. So there are a lot of websites you can go on and just check, for your specific device, how to take 5 minutes and turn off a lot of those default settings like locations and things like that. That can make a big, big, big difference. We still have privacy law. It's not doom and gloom. There are protections that are there for you. And so by all means, turning off some things there. The second thing I would mention is really think about getting what's called a VPN or a virtual private network. This used to be a thing you'd only see in hacker movies. And now it's something that like my mother and my grandmother have. They're like $8 a month. And basically they ensure that your browser history and just the stuff you're doing on your phone and laptop isn't accessible to anybody who wants to look at it. Our laws are very, very weak when it comes to keeping your browser history a secret. And for a very, very small monthly fee that's not going to mess up your internet connection, there's a host of really professional, great services out there. It's called a VPN, and that's something that a lot of people can do. The final thing I'd say is take a serious look in the mirror and ask yourself the extent to which you might be suffering from tech addiction and whether or not a particular problem can be fixed with a low-tech solution. Is it absolutely necessary to use a face app to unlock your phone, which also means that you have facial recognition now, or can you just use a regular password? Do you absolutely need Alexa in your home, or could you maybe just get by with an old school to-do list or a calendar? Do you absolutely need to put information on your cloud, or could you maybe just use flash drives for everything like that and keep it secure? I'd also say if you have kids, especially growing up nowadays, try to teach them a healthy regard for privacy and remind them that it wasn't always like this and that there are still things that they should expect with regards to keeping their stuff secret.
Well, and Lawrence, if I understand correctly too, part of the suggestion here is for most of us, take the company that Lance and I work for here, right? As an example, TrueChat. It is a company that's based online. So the idea of cutting technology out completely isn't feasible, but that also doesn't mean that you have to let it invade every aspect of your life. And I think that sounds like part of what you're getting at, right? In other words, maybe I make a choice in this area, for example, to not use Face Unlock for my phone, but I still use the cloud to store files, in part because of the idea that if we use all of it, we're opening ourselves up to the potential for more breaches of our information or our information being used in ways we don't want to, where if we're taking some steps in areas to limit it, we're decreasing at least the overall likelihood that that's going to get disseminated in ways that we don't want, in part because it's easier to keep a handle on who has access to what of my info.
Right. Absolutely.
So now that we know how to protect ourselves a little bit, you quote near the end of the book, the greatest privacy question facing Americans is how best to ensure that those who have our data do not misuse it. So we can protect them from getting it. But for those that have it or that we need to give it to them to do things we want, that balance again, how do we accomplish how do we get to the point that then they don't misuse it? What can we do there?
So there are two steps that I think need to be taken by everyone in America. And it's up to you which step you want to take or if you want to take them at the same time. The first is we have to change our laws. We just do. And like you said, there's a lot of exciting stuff happening, but we have the weakest privacy protections of all the advanced democracies on planet Earth. And that's just not acceptable anymore in the 21st century. Our system of laws operates under something that's called a patchwork system. So different types of privacy, they're protected in different ways. Medical privacy is protected in one way. Financial privacy has a different set of rules. Consumer data has a different set of rules. What we need instead is to do something that resembles the comprehensive model used by the European Union. It's way stronger. Instead of just nitpicking, we have one set of laws. It's called omnibus protections, and all data receives the same level of protection as it moves through a life cycle. In some instances, that protection is stronger, but at the end of the day, the baseline's super strong. One easy set of protections because data is a fundamental right. So that's the law. If you're a cynic. If you don't believe in the power of lawmakers to get this done, if you think that the corporate interests are too powerful, if you're a cynic, no problem. The second step is with the marketplace. For the first time in American history, which I think is amazing, privacy, which spent most of the 20th century getting its ass kicked when it was ever came up against big business, privacy is now a commodity. Companies are presenting themselves as pro-privacy, and you can find out companies that care about that. I don't know if you've seen Apple's new iPhone commercials, but Apple, whether you like them or not, they make awesome commercials. Their entire ad campaign now is centered on data privacy and the fact that they're trying to protect your privacy. Whether they do or don't is, a very long conversation. But the fact that they're putting that out there shows that big corporations recognize that this is something people care about, whether it's about spending a couple of bucks on a VPN or about something that covers your laptop. There are companies that are putting privacy first. And if you don't believe the law can handle things, you can at least trust human greed. That at the end of the day, if corporate America recognizes that people care about their privacy and that they're willing to put their money into companies that protect their data and their privacy, that's something that's going to change things, especially in the United States of America, especially in our economic system. So I like to apply pressure on both ends because I still believe in the ability of the laws to change. But at the end of the day, there's a financial component too that everybody can dive in on and support those companies that do take active steps. They definitely want your money. They're selling the fact that they care about your privacy. So, help them thrive.
Well, and I think one of the interesting things is we have a number of interns here at True Chat, Lawrence, that are Gen Z,
right.
The guinea pig generation, if you will. And part of what we've talked to them about too, and one of the things that I've noticed in talking to people that age, one of the big privacy concerns that they actually do have is the camera on their devices, whether this is the webcam, the camera on their phone. And that may be because they saw one of those Black Mirror episodes on Netflix about, the very terrifying, obviously extreme scenario of what could happen if somebody gains access to that and you don't have any idea that somebody has accessed it. So, you see these crazy things with people putting like a piece of paper or tape or, God knows what else over their webcam to ensure, even though they don't think it's on, that it isn't actually on. And I think that one of the interesting things that we've seen now, and to your point about companies taking this more seriously, I think it's HP that now offers a laptop that has a physical kill switch, like a light switch for your camera, that isn't a software switch. It's not susceptible to being hacked. It's an actual physical switch on the side of the computer that disconnects power from the webcam so that it can't be accessed. And again, I think that's an example of what you're talking about. You apply market pressure. There's enough kids in particular, but also young adults and people who have technology that are concerned with, for example, the webcam, that you have a major computer manufacturer that's now gone so far as to put in this kill switch, so to speak. So that's kind of interesting, right? Because since we do live in that free economy, it's not just about what we can do with government, but also what we can do to put pressure on private industry.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just took from that too, though, with what you had said, it's kind of historical, right? We always have, we, the people, have a two-step process. If we don't like what's going on, we can change the laws and force it economically, whether we're talking about civil rights. And so we can, try to change the laws, but then also bus boycott, and hurt them economically, shop at certain stores, whatever. So this is the same fundamental way that we advocate for change, is that we talk to our lawmakers and push them to change the laws. But at the same time, we use our pocketbooks to force companies to behave the way we would like them to behave. Correct? Is that
whether that
too
means
simple
pulling your
or
business from a company that is very problematic with your privacy, or if it means putting your dollars into a company that is really focused on your privacy and realizes that they can make enough money without selling your data to people who want it. Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Lawrence, we really appreciate you taking time to be here with us today. If people want to get a hold of a copy of None of Your Damn Business, can they just find it pretty much anywhere books are found?
Yeah, we have ebooks and Amazon. So there's the hardcover, paperback will be out in a few months. And if you can also get a Kindle version, everything's up on Amazon. And it's called None of Your Damn Business.
And for our listeners, as always, thestateofus.org will be sure to link in our reading list, Lance and I's reading list, to None of Your Damn Business, Privacy in the United States from the Gilded Age to the Digital Age. Again, Lawrence, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Lance, we've challenged people this year, right? Year's almost coming to a close, so they got to get on it to invite new people to this conversation.
Talking to a group of people today and telling them, they go, "You have a podcast? Where do you get there?"
A podcast?
A podcast? Did I say a podcast?
A podcast?
Well, you can blue it, or you can say podcast. I don't care.
I like it. I think
all right.
I can.
I'll start a new one.
And we're talking with Lawrence today, right? We had this conversation because True Chat's pursuing, all the shows at True Chat pursue a common mission. What is that?
Well, our mission here at True Chat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations.
And so we've challenged people to become part of this conversation, right? To invite others into this conversation. And if you were going to tell somebody to tune in, what are all the ways they could do so?
Well, I'd say turn on your device and whatever that might be, and then go to your favorite place that you find podcast. And if you don't do that, then you can do it. You can find one through Spotify or Stitcher or Apple Podcast, or like I said, anywhere that you listen to podcasts, you ought to be able to find us.
For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change.